can see it, maybe you can give me a thumbs up just to let me know that you can see it, that it's clear on your screen. If you can't see it, let me know that you can't see it by just, you can unmute yourself and just let me know that you can't see it. One of the things that I want to be able to do is, as we go through the discussion and as we go through this presentation, is perhaps inform you from a perspective of awareness. You know, a lot of this is going to tie to certain historical aspects. It has to, because it has this nature in the historical construct in America. And so we'll do that. But I in no way want to just land this on a historical only presentation. I want to talk about concepts also. I want to talk about, you know, ideologies, and want to talk about different perspectives, you know, that impact Juneteenth. And then we'll look at, you know, why this is now recognized as a time of commemorative reflection, as a time of celebration. What does it mean to America as a whole? And so if you have questions as we go through our time together, feel free to, you know, raise questions. You can either raise them in the chat, and Carrie and Edmund, I will ask that if you see those in the chat, because of the nature of how I'm presenting, you can just bring those up in the discussion. We'll try to answer the questions to the best that we can, and where there's not a direct answer, then I know that I have homework to do to make sure I can get the answer that's appropriate to the question. So we'll kind of go through the presentation, and then the way that I operate is I like exchange. So if at one point or a point during the presentation, if you want to stop and raise a question, you know, that's okay too. But I'm going to continue to move. I have a lot of information I'm going to try to share, and let me just set the table here for how we'll go about this presentation. So our objectives are simply as follows. Let me go back to that. Moved on me. Our objectives are as follows. And so what we want to be able to do is expand, you know, on historical awareness of what June 19th really represents, 1865, which is a past aspect of it, then understand Juneteenth as a construct of liberation in America. And I'll use, you know, construct of liberation, and I'll explain why I'm saying construct of liberation. And I just didn't jump in and say Juneteenth as a time of freedom. Because that, you know, has a place where we need to understand, you know, freedom, and then the construct of liberation and how we're operating in the present. And then we'll explore the celebratory narrative. You know, there's a lot of celebration that goes on around the aspect of Juneteenth, what is now a national holiday. That's effective June 17th, 2021, when the President of the United States of America signed into law that Juneteenth is now a federal and a national holiday. It had been a holiday in several states as the states had legislated, but now it is a national holiday. So we'll talk a little bit about the aspects of the celebratory component of it, because that's a big part of Juneteenth as well. And then, you know, because this is something that we should always be in a position to consider, what's the call to action when it regards equity in America? Because Juneteenth is a representation of trying to establish a platform of equity in America. And equity is different than equality, because a lot of times we'll see those two things when we're talking about certain relations in America and how people are treated in America, you know, and all men are created equal, and those types of statements. But equity is not the same as equality. And so what Juneteenth did was probably launch certain aspects of looking at equity. And so we'll deal with that in terms of, you know, what's our thinking about engaging in a call to action for equity. And then expectations. So for those of you all who, you know, may find it, you know, a little aggregate to talk about things like enslaved people or slavery or something like those concepts, or, you know, oppression, or, you know, things of that nature. That will be in this conversation, but you can be courageous and be comfortable in this space. I don't want you to be uncomfortable. I want you to be comfortable, to engage, to be courageous and try to share from a place of realness. You know, I think it's really good when we take opportunities to exchange with one another in terms of how we perceive certain aspects of talking about America in its totality and its history. And then we'll respect diverse views in a safe space. Safe space means that, say what you're thinking in a way that it respects the overall uh, forum that we have here. And if you want to speak frankly, that's okay. As long as we're trying to derive something that, moves us into a better position of learning more about who we are and how we can be better as a group. And then be comfortable with the uncomfortable. Some of the things that I probably will say may be challenging for some to hear. They may be, okay in the nature of how it's being said, but it's challenging in terms of some of the stuff is the facts of the realness that we have to deal with. So we be comfortable with the uncomfortable, but for a positive outcome. And then, in our time together, we're not going to try to solve everything that's happening in America and the time that we have remaining, because there's a lot that goes into, this context. So we'll jump right into it. General Orders number 3, Galveston, Texas, June 19, 1865. So you see this gentleman down here, Major General Granger. He's associated with this order. This order is also referred to as the Juneteenth order. It was an order that was moved into a space in Texas, the space or the city called Galveston. And when that came into Galveston, this came right at the tail end of the Civil War. And so I think it's important because a lot of people say, well, did he read the statement himself? And there's some discussion about whether or not this was the gentleman that actually read this particular read this particular statement or not. Some people say that he was just there to enforce the emancipation orders, which had actually came out like 2 to 3 years before 1865. And so now after the Civil War, these orders were given to this one space or this state in Texas from Galveston. And I'm going to read this because I think it needs to be just read for your hearing, but I'll read quickly. And it read like this: whether General Granger read it or not is not really completely resolved. Sometimes when you hear about General Orders number 3, they'll say he read it, but history doesn't really say that he read it. He may have been there as the general to enforce it. And this is what he was there to enforce: that the people of Texas are informed that in accordance with the proclamation from the executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them that becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. I thought that was an interesting part of the statement. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect military posts. And excuse me while I move my cursor here. There we go. Collect at military posts, and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. So America, after the Civil War, came to this conclusion that there needed to be some statement of equitable treatment for humanity. That's the way I'm looking at it. That's why I'm saying some of this is a concept presentation, because while they were talking about enslaved people, and by the way, I'm not a big fan of calling people of Black ancestry slaves, because they didn't put themselves in that position. They were enslaved. So I use the terminology enslaved people. And so what they were looking to do is see if they can create an equitable platform for all of humanity in America. But you can still see in this statement alone how they were grappling with how that would actually be carried out, where all slaves are free, but then they were advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. So one would say, well, why did that even have to be in the general orders? If they're free, let them be free. But they had to establish some type of order of how this equity would be carried out. And so this order right here, this order launched this whole concept and this ideology of what equity and then what liberation would begin to look like in America. And so let me go to the next one. And so what's significant about this? Well, the significance of this particular order is that in 1862, to your left, Lincoln says, this is an emancipation proclamation that all persons held as slaves within said designated states and parts of states are and henceforth shall be free. That was 3 years before 1865. So there was this really push for people to be treated equitably, but this order really brought about a change in historical American culture. Because prior to this 1865, prior to Lincoln even coming on the scene, the states were in what's called a union, right? And so in 1777, they had these states that were joining this union in America, because, prior to 1777, we have 1776, which is basically America saying we no longer want to be under Great Britain's rule. We want to be in and of ourselves independent as a country, as a union, as the United States. And so immediately after that, because prior to even 1776, and this is something I want you to know, not everybody that came to America was okay with slavery. Prior to 1619, there were intermingling of people in American history. There were Black people that were married to certain aspects of Spaniards in America, on the land of America. That's prior to 1619, in the 1500s. A lot of times we think that every person of color that ever came to America and they was enslaved. That's not history. We're only taught that aspect of history because that history purports a certain perspective of economic situational gain. And now we'll talk a little bit about that later as well. But in 1777, because the narrative of how people really should be treated was not shared by everybody in America. So 1777, after the Constitution, you had states in the North saying, we will no longer uphold slavery in our states. And those were the northern states. So we don't want to treat people in a way that's not in accordance to how humans should be treated. And they say, well, we can base our economy and still have a good economy and treat people by just paying them as opposed to subjugating them to oppression to work under. Well, the southern states wasn't too popular with that. That wasn't too popular with them, 1777. So this 1777 period ushered in a great divide. You had the southern states beginning to succeed or pull out of the Union because they no longer agreed with the perspective of aspects of really what was just considered a capitalistic perspective. How do we treat people, or how do we use people as commodity for our gain? And the people in the northern states said, we can't treat them this way because we don't agree that this is the way that you treat humanity. But the southern states said, no, we agree that this works well for us. So what happened and what makes this general order, this Juneteenth order, so significant is because it really ushered in a change in a historical American culture. And it really challenged the Great Divide. And the Great Divide had happened way back in 1777. That's when you had the North and the South. So that's when you have the Union and the Confederates. The Union up north and the Confederate South. Abraham Lincoln becomes president in 1861. And I also want you to know what's really interesting is before Juneteenth orders were issued, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. He was assassinated in April. The orders came out in June, 1865. So they were already saying Abraham Lincoln is coming in with a different ideology that's changing our economic structure, that's challenging how we progress in terms of a country under a system that uses people as capital gain. And so that doesn't go down too well in terms of viewpoints from Abraham Lincoln. But Abraham Lincoln was under this kind of push to say, well, how do I protect the Union? What's the best way for me to preserve the Union? And it really wasn't initially about slavery or enslaved people initially. It was about how do we preserve capitalistic interests of the Union as a whole. And so what Abraham Lincoln said is that part of this is we need to kind of leave slavery alone. And aspects of Abraham Lincoln was not that he always talked about just freeing slaves, because there were certain aspects of his concepts that said, well, maybe we can free them and send them back to Africa. This was part of a portion of Abraham Lincoln's thinking. Well, that did not go over too well with those people who wanted to just be free, Black people that wanted to just be free in America, and they wanted to proliferate based upon the same concepts that came out of 1776. They wanted to do the same things that they were reading from 1776. And one of the huge proponents of this thought mindset, Frederick Douglass. I'll talk a little bit about him later. So the Emancipation Proclamation was drafted in 1862. Wasn't a law, but that was the statement. That's part of the statement that it says to your left. And then in 1863, it became a law. But when it became a law, let me go down to this next one here. Well, okay. When it became a law, it began to challenge the historical American culture. This is the one where I want to take just a little bit of time to kind of dial out for you, because this is the one that probably, this particular slide that we're going to talk about for a few minutes, is probably the one that makes the Juneteenth orders, that makes Juneteenth itself so significant. Is because in 1865, this culture right here, 1 through 8, was challenged. Now, exclusive capitalism happened in 1619. And when I say exclusive capitalism, somebody may ask, well, why don't you just say capitalism? Well, because exclusive capitalism was that for this select group of people, this exclusive group of people that wanted power, gain, position, wealth, and authority. They looked at, man, here's a way that we can do this on this American soil, unlike it's never been done before. So while we may have heard of ships called the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, and if I say those ships, we think about the pilgrimage, we think about the pilgrims, we think about Christopher Columbus, we think about that expedition. But then just after 1619, there's the ship called the White Lion. And the White Lion is not talked a lot about in history, because the White Lion is where exclusive capitalism began to introduce how to use people as capital, use people as product. And so slavery had already existed in other parts of the world. So America wasn't the first, we know this, America wasn't the first country to do it, but America was the first one to do it in an industrialized thinking society. We were talking earlier, and I was saying how America is really influential in terms of being at the forefront of visionaries, thought leaders, industry, capitalistic gain, which are not, none of those things are bad. But this exclusive part of it says, well, we'll take people, we'll use the commerce that we have, and we'll go to aspects, now watch this, of Africa and trade our product for people. So I know this is not said a lot in certain concepts and certain ideologies, but African people had something to do with trading African people to America for slavery. I know we don't talk about that a lot. We tend to think all African people were just enslaved, but the ships went to the coast of Africa. They didn't go into the mainland of Africa. They traded for African slaves. And so this is how exclusive capitalism was being challenged based upon this Juneteenth thing. And then the second part is indoctrinated unhealthy beliefs. So now people began to believe that it was okay to treat humans inequitably. As a matter of fact, to treat them as if they were not human. And here's the thing about that. And now this is conceptual, so just bear with me. Anytime somebody can believe in their own mind that it's okay to treat another human less than human, something's not healthy with that thinking, period. Period. There's nothing healthy about that kind of thinking. Everybody would at least say, do unto others as you would want to have done unto yourself. Well, there's nobody that I know of that wants to be enslaved, not in the way that this type of slavery was happening. But then you started to get documents, because these were smart people that was in America in the 1600s. And so by the 1700s, they started circulating thought-driven documentation to reinforce how their unhealthy beliefs could use people as property for their own gain. And out of that, here's an example. We have what's called the Willie Lynch letter and the making of a slave, 1712. Whereas, to the bottom text, nature provides Black people with the natural capacity to take care of their offspring. So this is what Willie Lynch says. We'll break that natural string of independence from them and thereby create a dependency status so that we may be able to get from them useful production for our business and pleasure. So not only did they view these people as product, they also viewed them as tools for a variety of different, it says business and pleasure. And so that created this belief. Then there was this colonial conquest. By the 1760s, as we said earlier, these unions started saying, we want to be separate and apart and we want to be our own. So, but the colonial conquest was that we want to be our own, but our mindset, because of some of these unhealthy beliefs that had started to be indoctrinated into the 1700s, 1760s, was anti-BOPIC, which is Black, Indigenous, People of Color. So now I don't think originally that when all this stuff was going on, that it was just this view of racism. In other words, when people who were part of the colonial conquest, which predominantly Europeans, when they saw Black folks, they were like, well, I just don't like them because they Black. And we have some of that thinking right now, and you all know that. We call it racist or racism. You know that to be true. Some people just get into a space, say, well, I don't like people just because of the color of their skin, whether they're Black, white, brown, whatever. We know how we do right now. But at that time, it had more to do with this exclusive capitalism, fueled by these unhealthy beliefs. And then I think over a period of time, people started making these thoughts based upon, well, these people are less than. But interestingly enough, they were less than because they were treated less than. So the very people that the racist perspective is against. So when you have racism, you're against something that actually has been created by a thought that you have. So it's interesting. So this colonial conquest was this anti-BOPIC, which is Black, Indigenous, People of Color. And then it went to what is called like an inequitable constitution. Uh-oh, somebody said the Constitution. That all men are created equal. Liberty and justice for all. Well, here's the thing. In 1776, everything that I said 1 through 3 was in full effect. And it was gaining in power. Exclusive capitalism, how you view people in terms of being inhuman and how you view them as property, indoctrinated unhealthy beliefs. I just showed you the Willie Lynch letter and the making of a slave. There was more documents that were being circulated underground, just like this document here. That stuff was growing. Colonial conquest and how that viewed an anti-BOPIC society in the 1760s. Well, by 1776, when America launched out its independence, they talked all throughout the document about liberty, about freedom, about justice, about equality. It's all throughout the document, all throughout the Constitution. When the Statue of Liberty was given to America, people were protesting. Early Quakers in American history in the late 1600s were protesting against how people in America were treating slaves. So there were issues that a lot of people in America recognized that, wait a minute, something's not right with the way that we're dealing with people. And then we backed it up with a constitution that says that certain people in America are not even full people. What the heck does it mean to be 3/5 of a person? What does that look like? I don't know, 2/3 of a person? But those kind of ideologies were being backed by this constitutional document. And then from that inequitable, so that I didn't say that it wasn't a good document. We can challenge that narrative as well. I'm just pointing out right now that it was an inequitable document in 1776 because it didn't treat all humanity equitably. And then number 5 is that we had institutional enslavement. So here's the interesting thing. So the document was written, the Constitution, and then right on the heels of the Constitution, they formed policies and procedures that institutionalize enslavement. In other words, not only are we going to write the Constitution, but what we'll do is we'll back it with legal documents that will give us rights to treat these people this way legally. So those two kind of was interesting in terms of the narrative of Juneteenth. Keep Juneteenth in mind. So then that heightened human oppression, so really from 1777 to 1865, if you ask me, that's when America really just went, it really went extreme in terms of how it begun to deal with people of African descent in America. Because in that period, that's 1777 to 1865, that's probably the most drastic period in that era of how people of African descent was treated in America. And right through that period, 1777 to 1865, drops in the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. And then some would argue that systemic injustice, America has been grappling with that from 1865, right, until present day. And so this Juneteenth challenged the makeup of this particular map. You know, you had a map now where you have in 1865, you have Union states to the north and to the west, where they were not supporting slavery. You had Union territories, which you see in the light blue, which is not supporting slavery. You had the border Union states, which supported slavery just above the southern states. Bleeding Kansas is really a term that referred to Kansas was really in a battle within itself to decide which way it was going to go. So they use the term Bleeding Kansas because Kansas was in a war within its own state. And then you had the Confederate states to the south. You can see Galveston right there. You see Galveston, the little point. That's the general area where Galveston was. And then you'd have and so all of the red upheld slavery. And then the Union territories, which is in the gold, which would uphold slavery. And so then, let me go back to here, okay. And so then that lands us to Texas, 1865. This is pre-Juneteenth. This is Texas, because Texas is significant to the establishment of Juneteenth. Texas was a Western Confederate state. It was far off to the west. If you go back and you look at that map again, you can see where it was. So you see of all these Confederate states to the south, how far west Texas is. And because Texas was so far west, they were not engaged in the war in the same way that those other states to the east was engaged. They were almost like, then they were engaged in it, but they were almost like this standalone. In other words, you know, we're far removed from how the messaging is coming through. You know, the messaging really may filter down from the north. Well, to get to the north, you got to get through these main states, you know, through the south. They wasn't doing a whole lot of traveling through these Union territories. So Texas was kind of holding out almost off to its own in a way. And then Galveston, what makes Galveston so significant to the Juneteenth order is that Galveston was a major hub for Texas. It sits right on the shore. It's a great place for porting, which means where the ships can come in, where merchandise can come in. And anytime you have a major hub, that's going to be a stronghold for your particular state. And so Galveston at that particular time, especially in 1865, was probably one of the most predominant places in Texas, both for export, import, commerce, capitalism for the state, as well as military defense. And so that made Texas kind of this really interesting anomaly in terms of where it's set in America. And so being out there to the far west as a Western state, but Texas had a really peculiar thing when it came to slavery. Randall Campbell, who was a Texas historian, said that because of the way that Texas had its import coming off the coast, the way Texas industry was expanding, which was a little later than some of the other industries, Texas got a hold of slavery and it became a virtual empire for slavery. In other words, they were using slaves all over Texas, especially by 1865. It was a big deal for them because there are certain things that happen in the South that don't happen in the North. One of the examples of what happens in the South that may have impacted a little bit of what was hitting Texas is the cotton mills, because they had industry. Remember, I told you that, America was these great thought leaders. And so they designed ways to actually use mills to process cotton, to use cotton to turn that into the materials and stuff that we use for a variety of different purposes. But the mills didn't pick the cotton. They needed people to do that. So they were holding on to slaves because slaves were beneficial for them to do things such as that. And then that made slavery germane to Texas economy. Coming out of Galveston. Galveston was this military base, as we said before, so they wanted to protect Galveston. So it was very important that Galveston not be torn apart, because that would have a big impact on the rest of Texas. And Texas being that kind of economic hub in a way in terms of how it was looked at. And then enslaved people back in 1865, they did not really have a widespread thought or idea that an Emancipation Proclamation had even been issued. Again, far south, far to the west. I believe some of the southern states in the Confederacy probably began to hear about it. So there were rumors of it. But when this announcement was made, people were buzzing already in the northern states. But 1865, a whole lot of the people that were enslaved in Texas had no idea that this was going on. And so what happened is, under the order, the executive order, Sheridan, who was a military soldier, a major, Sheridan, under Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, who we know became one of America's presidents, ordered Granger, that was the person I saw in the initial order, to enforce the emancipation with military force. And so Granger went to Galveston. He said, let us go to the place, because they had people coming up from a variety of different places to go into Texas. And by the way, there were regiments of Black soldiers that were in Texas, because as we know, we had Black soldiers fighting in the Civil War. This was right at the tail end of the Civil War. There were several hundreds of thousands, if you will, maybe 200,000 military people made up of Black soldiers. So they were in aspects of Texas to basically enforce this Emancipation Proclamation. And so Granger went to this Osterman building, which was like a commercial residential type building in Galveston. I'll show you a picture of that earlier. And that's where the orders were sent, to that building in Galveston, the Osterman building. And so that order, let me go back here. So you can see it right there. This is one of the areas, a view of houses between 22nd and 23rd Streets in Galveston, Texas. And that's a picture of what it looked like in about 1865. And so as you can see, 1865, you would think, well, maybe it wasn't as developed as what you're seeing right there, but you can see it was pretty well developed. So they wanted to maintain, that particular city of Galveston and keep it intact from what they felt could be fallout based upon this Juneteenth order. So that's what Granger went to protect. Here's another picture I'll show you. So that arrow that you see to the top, that arrow pointing to that building there, is where they say the orders came, the Juneteenth orders, the June 19th, 1865 orders. This is where Granger set up his positioning for his troops there. And that was kind of his command center, where he would have troops and give them orders throughout that particular city and have orders sent from that area to other parts of Texas. But this is where the particular orders probably came, in that particular building. And then here's some pictures of people throughout Texas. And this is at the 1800s. This is probably during these periods of time. The interesting thing to point out is where you can see these soldiers here. So if ever you see a picture like this probably means that this was taken somewhere between 1860 and maybe just on the cusp of this order going out in 1865, because these generals would go out to make sure that the people were being protected, which I also thought was another interesting thing about the nature of the history of America at that time. These generals, Union generals from the North, They were protecting aspects of the concept of liberty. That's what they were protecting. They were protecting aspects of the concept of liberation. And so how they viewed it at that particular time, because I'm sure maybe some of their thoughts may have been, conflicted, do we do this for people of color because we realize this is the way that they were treated in the South, and they had a different view of what they saw up north. But I think what they realized is, let's carry out the orders, because that represents, the integrity of at least what this particular Constitution is striving to get at. And so that's just one picture. Here's another picture. And I would take it that this picture, because I don't have the actual dates on all these images, but I did do a little research on some of these images. Like an image like this could probably be right after June 19th, 1865. And you will ask, well, why? Look very closely at the expression. See these expressions, how he looks relaxed. This person here, you could tell that person looks like they're smiling. That person seems to be happy. Typically, these particular pictures, people, if they're caught in a photograph prior to this period of time, wasn't a whole lot of smiling going on, like you can see in the workers. But this particular one seems to suggest that it could be just at the cusp or right after the June 19th, 1865. And then this was what I was telling you about earlier. This is what made it a mainstay, or aspects of a mainstay in certain parts of the South, is that this whole cotton thing was a big deal. It was a huge deal in terms of how the South was generating capitalistic interest. And so that moves to this aspect of challenging the pre-1865 concept of liberation in America. Now, there's a great debate out there amongst a variety of different people in America, specifically a lot of people in the African-American community. When did liberation actually take place? Was it July 4th, 1776, which we know what that represents in American history? Or was it actually this date that we're talking about now, today's date, June 19th? So that's like a holistic independence debate concept. So Frederick Douglass, back in 1852, he challenged aspects of that narrative. He was addressing citizens of his hometown in Rochester, and he gave a really emphatic speech, and he was an awesome orator. So he was already looked at as one who was going to deliver a great speech. And they really thought that his speech was just going to be celebratory, that he was just going to get up there and talk about the greatness of the 76th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. But in his mind, he was thinking about the concept of liberation in America. What does that mean? So you see it, part of his speech printed out there. But I was saying this earlier in our conversation. So now, if the whole is not free, then how can the whole claim to be free? When you walk down the street, right, you want every part of your body to go with you. If one of those parts is unable to go, or for whatever reason is upheld by something, then I'm sure that you don't feel liberated to move around. And so that's just an analogy to probably where Frederick Douglass was, former slave. So he understood the concept, had some issues in terms of his ideologies with certain abolitionists as well. But then in the middle of this presentation, where they just thought it was going to be a charge. Remember, he's a hometown guy now in his own home place. He drops this in. He says, "What to the American slave is your 4th of July?" And I believe after he just did that part of it, I think there was a buzz in the air. That buzz dissipated quickly because he caught their attention. He said, "Well, what is he talking about?" And then he says, "I answer, a day that reveals to him, to the enslaved, more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which the enslaved person is the constant victim." And so a lot of people seem to sometimes challenge the narrative. And I think July 4th has at its base, so that you want to know my thought, has at its base the intent for liberation. but it was inequitable when it was written. So now it becomes questionable as to what this Juneteenth declaration meant. Because by June 19th, 1865, these people that didn't know this, 2 years or 3 years, removed from the Emancipation Proclamation. And as a matter of fact, it took them 2 months, after the end of the war to actually see that this had taken place, that the war had been won, that there was no more slavery, because then the results of the war actually reinforced the emancipation. And so now, if you kind of look at it based on this concept, wondering how those people back then were feeling when this word began to spread. That, man, think of it this way. Everything they've been saying to us since 1776, we actually may have a chance to be a part of. Because at 1776, the stuff that was written in that document, enslaved people couldn't participate in any of that. They didn't have any rights. And so coming out of that, I think you can begin to see why there was an air of jubilation, perhaps surrounding the day that's known as Juneteenth. So then there was a reaction to it. And it wasn't immediate. The reaction was not immediate because not everybody knew. And as a matter of fact, in Galveston, there were not as many slaves per capita in Galveston, Texas, as there were in all the other areas in the cities of Texas, Houston and San Antonio and some of those other areas. They had larger populations of enslaved people. So when the order itself, the Juneteenth order, the general order, when that was probably declared or read by whomever read it, was probably read to a bunch of predominantly Caucasian people. But they were the citizens, and so they heard it at the time. And so a lot of them who were connected with slave owners or slave owners who were there in the region began to spread the word. Some of them did not want to spread the word, so they kept it to themselves. Why? Because of number 2, the reality of the slaveholders' loss. And we're going to talk about the impact of the slaveholders' loss real quick. But 1865 to 2021, that's why I put 1865 to 2021. Some of this ideology, the reality of not necessarily slaveholder, but that's why I put loss in red. The reality of loss is still impacting thinking today because people are threatened to feel that they're losing something if equity is really given to all people. If we make it equitable for everybody, then I must be losing something. And that goes back now to that earlier slide that I showed before. Now, I use the term indoctrination because it can be passed on at a young age. And so by the time you get old enough to really question it, you've been so trained to think it, it's hard for you to question that everybody can just be treated equitably in a society that claims liberty and justice for all. So this is acknowledged liberation. And then the reluctance to record and share history. There was not a really great expanse of history about Juneteenth. I was talking earlier to both Carrie and Edmund, and I told them I didn't learn about Juneteenth until later on in my adult life. I didn't grow up getting this history in an educational system in America, in city of Chicago. I went to college at Howard University in Washington, D.C. That's a historically Black college and university. And I don't remember a whole lot of information being shared about Juneteenth there. So at this particular time, 1865, coming out of it, there was a reluctance to record and share this history. Now we can explore what that means, and maybe there's some questions about why we didn't think, they shared it. But what they did do is in the later parts or the middle parts of the 1900s, the early parts of the 1900s, if you will, they created what was called the slave narratives from 1936 to 1938, where you had a group of writers that decided that they were going to do some research and go deep into the South and see if they can interview anybody that was willing to talk about any remembrance that they had of Juneteenth so they could begin to record it. Because they had heard of aspects of Juneteenth from a historical perspective, but they never could find out why any information was really not gathered about that. So they created what was called the slave narratives. And then coming out of that, also circulation of propaganda began to take place. Like this rendition that you see here, the Day of Jubilo, which photographs an illustration showing how people may have begun to respond to their liberation once they heard about it. That there probably was dancing or celebration or happiness. You have to put this in the construct of everything that I just told you. And they knew that history. They knew that history coming out of 1776. They were closer to it. That they knew the history, especially that history in early 1800s. And they had seen these things taking place. So they realized that, man, we have this opportunity. It's worth celebrating. And so that's what really just launched this aspect of celebration, the impact of the realization. So this gentleman, now this comes from the federal writers who did the slave narrative. That's what we were talking about before. So his name is Felix Haywood. In 1937, 92 years old, and he was interviewed. He was one of the former slaves that was interviewed. And this is an excerpt from what he said, that everybody went wild when they found out about Juneteenth, how they felt like heroes, and nobody made us this way ourselves. We was free, just like that, we was free. And to them, it was like instantaneously, because other people had been hearing about it over time. There had been rumors. Remember, this news kind of hit them right then and there, because they were the last in that area of the Confederate to the far south, far west, to actually hear about it. And he said that people responded to them in a decent manner. But watch this, I'm going to give you a little something here. Be with me. They went right on giving us food just the same. Nobody took our homes away. Now, he was interviewed in 1937. So you had to remember, prior to that, 1921, in Oklahoma City, you had the Black Wall Street. And Tulsa, Oklahoma, you had Black Wall Street. So I'm wondering if he thought about aspects or had even heard about it, because he says nobody took our homes away. Well, that's not how they treated the people in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Black Wall Street. And remember now, watch it. So what I said is loss. Remember, I had a little sentence where I said slaveholders lost. Well, Black Wall Street was a reaction to what somebody thought they were losing if Black people started to proliferate and actually live out aspects of the 1776 Constitution. So when people feel threatened by loss, they typically respond. But he said, they were on the move. They seemed to want to get closer to freedom, like it was a place that they were going, like a city. And I can imagine that, man, being free means just let me go, let me run, let me see what's on the other side of, the street that I've never been on. Let me see what's on the other side of the bushes that I've never been on. Let me see what's on the other side of the country that I've never visited. So they probably had that sense, but they also realized that they still had to maintain some type of livelihood. In other words, they had to be earners of some kind. And, they understood what freedom was, and they thought that, it was going to get rich. Now watch this, like the white folks, because we were stronger. Now this is his viewpoint, and knowed how to work. And the whites didn't. And they didn't have us to work for them anymore, which created some consternation. But it didn't turn out that way, he says. And basically what he's saying in that statement, that it didn't turn out that way, is though that it was a liberational movement in Juneteenth, the inequities still impacted him. Now he's saying this in 1937, right? But he experienced it as a 15-year-old kid in 1865, if my math is right. And then what he said is, we soon found out that freedom could make folks proud, but it didn't make them rich. And so that's just a statement of equity. And that's why, I'm trying to position this discussion from an equitable standpoint, that we understand that if we're going to be true in our liberation, then liberation means equity for all people. Okay, so spreading the word throughout Texas, it took time and various means. So not everybody got the word immediately. Some of the slave masters told their former enslaved people. Some of the enslaved people would talk to one another because of some of the propaganda that began to circulate under scenes with graphics, like the little artwork that I showed and things like that. They began to see it. So it began to spread over time. But when it spread, especially in aspects of Galveston and certain other aspects of Texas, it had an impact on crime because people didn't really know how to immediately deal with certain aspects of freedom because they wanted gain. They still wanted some type of economic gain. They still had to have some means by which to live. And so what history has said is that they were forming different types of gangs. And now watch this. This wasn't just gangs of Black people. These were people now along economic lines. So you can have whites and Blacks in a gang in the 1800s, trying to figure out how to, I guess, as a better terminology, survive under these conditions and get through. So what they would do and what became a big issue is they would set fires, arsons. And they would set fires as a means of diversion. And while the fires was burning on this side, they would go on the other side and they would steal. To the point where they had to have these generals to come back into Galveston and heavy military command and get control of that. And so that was happening immediately as a fallout of 1865. And so the required government to make statements of assurance. And so some of these statements I put before you so you can see them, like Elijah Curtis, another major general from the Union. He stated in 1860, now this is the day after, this is July 17th, I'm sorry, a month after, a month after, July 17th, 1865. Much trouble and annoyance is caused by the failure of planners to enter into contracts with former enslaved people. You had the former slave masters that did not want to enter into contract with former enslaved people. They believed those people should still be working for free. As a matter of fact, the mindset in a lot of aspects of Texas slave owners, if you will, was that this was temporary. This Juneteenth proclamation would eventually go away and things would be restored back to the same old 1776 order. But then Christopher Andrews, who was another major general in the Union, he began to try to coerce a little bit, that, well, holidays must be put off until the crops are gathered. He was telling the former freed people that the military authority insists that they remain on plantations with former masters. The more industrious, the more obedient, the more patient and well-behaved the freedmen are, the better it will be for them now and hereafter in all respects. So they were still grappling with how to deal with liberation for all people. They still needed workers. So in a way, Hayward was right. They needed somebody to do the things that they had never done before. They didn't have the experience to do it. And these cropping and harvesting seasons was big business, especially in aspects of the South and in Texas. And then Andrews would go on to say later on in July 20th, all of this was part of the same statement. Let me say to the freed people that they need have no doubts about their liberty because people were beginning to question whether or not this was a hoax. Should we celebrate or are we celebrating prematurely? They may rest assured, he says, that they will never again be held or sold as slaves. And then this was the one, this last one that I read. That's why I put these four up here. But this last one to the bottom right was really one that caught me in terms of a call to action. It says, and this was read by the same general, when a man swears that he will abide by the proclamation freeing slaves, he binds himself before God to consider it a finality. And it says a man's duty to his country begins, not ends, when he takes the amnesty oath, because they were taking an oath that they would uphold the constructs of the Juneteenth order. And so when you take the oath, Andrew says he cannot merely remain passive. In other words, you have to be active in what it means to be equitable. But there was a response to the concept of Juneteenth. And like I said, past, present, and future. From 1865 to 1871, the Greek word, which means circle, and the other aspect at the end, which means of friends or of brothers, was created. The circle of friends or brothers, translated Ku Klux Klan, from 1865 to 1871. So it kind of died down a little bit, then picked up again, 1915 to 1944. And that period right there, that 1915 to 1944 period, is probably when it really began to propagate certain aspects of media and social impact. That period, that middle period, that 1915 and 1944, because although it waned in that aspect of 44, it came back in 1950. And things were happening in 1950 that people didn't believe would happen. In 1950, they didn't think it would happen. Now you got to realize by 1950, man, you had some well-educated people all over the country from all walks of life, all walks of life. And so what they were experiencing, they never thought they would experience in America, coming out of the understanding of what Juneteenth meant to them, and then how they thought that Juneteenth was a reinforcement of 1776. But remember, what I said is resistance to perceived loss. And so that moves into modern day aspects of thinking, when people are now taken to college campuses to say, hey, we're very, very well educated and very, very well organized in terms of the resistance, so that you understand the nature of our resistance is not going away. Somebody said, well, maybe it is going away. Well, then January 6th would rise up on us. And what I'm telling you is this: that bottom picture to the bottom right, that flag right there represents all of the blood that was spilled in fighting for liberation and equity for all people in America from 1861 to 1865. And that flag was brought into the place that represents liberation for all America. Now, how was that allowed? I have no idea. I will never be able to explain that. But that right there, that image, is a resistance to perceived loss. In other words, I'm going to lose something if equity is given to everybody, all people. I'm going to lose, because I don't have any problem with anybody wanting their people to win or whatever. You know, everybody wants somebody to win something, especially when it comes to politics. I'm not getting into that aspect of it. But when you start threatening the aspects of the very things that's pronounced, if you will, in aspects of the Constitution, that really Juneteenth then said, okay, we're going to back that up with something even stronger than the Constitution. In a way, we're going to reinforce the Constitution, so to speak. Then some people could say, well, it's a perceived loss for me if that kind of equity is just given to everyone. So now this just becomes a teaching and learning celebration. That's what Juneteenth is all about. You know, it was no immediate commemoration consensus after June 19th. Some people looked at January 1st as Freedom Day. Some people still do. They look at that because of the law that was passed of the proclamation was January 1st. So they say, well, January 1st must have been the proclamation, Freedom Day, I'm sorry. And then some people look at April 19th because that's when the Confederates surrendered to the Union. They look at that as Surrender Day. And then June 22nd is when the proclamation statement was released by Lincoln. And some people look at that particular day as a day. But then overall, Juneteenth emerged as this high time for the recognition of what it meant for America to be liberated. And I want to stick a pin in that, because we think, well, Black folks was just liberated. No, all people were liberated on June 19th, 1865. All of them, everybody. So America at 1865, you know, took a look at living up to its creed, as Dr. Martin Luther King would say. But as we know, the civil rights would say some other things in terms of those struggles. Some conditions got worse than they were before, as we pointed out. Accounts of celebrations still remain elusive, but we do have one early commemorative account, which happened June 16th, 1866, which was a picnic, which was a grand parade in Houston. But then you began to see growing aspects of the celebrations, which would break out in the 1900s. They were doing it in the 1800s, but they really got formal with it as time moved on, because the more they thought about it and the further they got away from that initial date, the more significant it came for that celebration to be ingrained in aspects of American culture. And some people may say, since 1865 was the day that all people were liberated, it then becomes the oldest commemoration of emancipation in American history, because you can't say the same thing about 1776, right? You can't say, well, 1776, we all celebrated because we were all free. Well, you can't say that. But in 1865, one could say, well, based upon the orders, we were all free. And so we could all celebrate together at least. So you have some people who celebrate both. They'll celebrate July 4th and they'll celebrate June 19th. And that's what these pictures represent. These parades of celebration, bands that would play, and different picnics. Picnics were huge, a part of this. And the reason why picnics was such a big ordeal is because it represented Black people, listen to me carefully, being able to celebrate outdoors in public without fear of being battered, tormented, or being oppressed. And aspects of Houston would protect some of these picnics, the early picnics that they had. And they thought that these picnics would be like a one and done picnic, but they continued to go on. And then Galveston, this gentleman here, Pastor John Henry Jack Yates, he brought land through his church, Antioch Baptist Church, and established what was called the Emancipation Parks in Houston. And so Emancipation Park is tied to Antioch Baptist Church, which is one of the early emancipation parks that they purchased, that Black people purchased in Houston, where they would begin to have the picnics like the image that I just showed you. And then there was a process to amend the Constitution. 1865, the 13th Amendment said there were no slaves. Now, mind you, the Constitution had to be amended, had to be revised, had to be edited. And that goes back to what I was saying about an inequitable Constitution, 1776. So 1865, 13th Amendment said no slave. 1868, the 14th Amendment says now everybody are citizens. Not only are not slaves, but you have the right now to be treated as citizens. But look at the dates, how it took time for this to happen. 1870, Fifth Amendment, voting rights. And then the 15th Amendment, voting rights. And then so civil rights sparked a renewed interest in Juneteenth through the 1970s. And then you have Texas makes Juneteenth a state holiday, 1979, 1990. Texas makes MLK a state holiday. See all these interesting aspects about the core of Texas and how Texas kind of becomes this hub, of liberation for America, but never really taught this way. And then 2006, this gentleman named Sam Collins to your left, he's a financial planner. He said that there was a statue actually that had been put in 2006 in Galveston, but it wasn't put, Sam Collins says, but why didn't you put something on the site next to the Osterman building where the actual order came? So in June 21st, 2014, Sam Collins got together, put together a order and was successful in doing it to get a marker to commemorate the location of where the Juneteenth order came in to Galveston, Texas at the site of the Osterman building. So that's the picture that you see there. Today, people are celebrating all over the place. Yesterday, June 17th, in the middle there, you see Biden signs the order. There's a variety of different people celebrating in a lot of different ways. But the celebration still has intact with it work that can be done. And then our call to action is simply this: gain an awareness of where you are in terms of the complexities that challenge American society. Yep, so it's those concepts. And some of them are aggregate, but we have to understand, aspects of our history and our present so that we can build aspects of a more productive and positive society for our future, which America is in a position to do, actually. And then search out America's history. The reason why you have to search it out is because for whatever reason, it's not taught the way it should be taught. I still believe that in certain aspects of educational systems, there's miseducation. In other words, we're not getting it all. And then share with others who are different than you in ethnicity and values and interests. Not necessarily that you have to agree on all things. This is a diversity and inclusion concept. You don't have to agree with all things, but you learn better when you share a little bit more with people who are different than you. And you take time to listen as you share. And then in the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, it's not possible to be in favor of justice for some people and not be in favor of justice for all people. Few resources. I will send the resources to you all through the library, but your library should have these books. These are great resource books for aspects of Juneteenth, which were used in aspects of my research. And then here's another one. This one to the left, 400 Souls. That is a fantastic book and worthy of anybody's reading that really wants to get an understanding of certain aspects of history in America that's probably not taught anywhere in any classes. But that's a really good book. And then this one to the right, Freedom from Slavery. That's a great book as well. And it helps aspects to tie the Emancipation Proclamation back to the cause and effect, and then what moved Juneteenth into this really positive moment in American history. That's my information right there. Or if you want to reach me, I'll leave that up there for a couple seconds as I know we're on time. If you want to reach me, want to reach out to me, if you have questions. I had to get that all in, so I didn't have a whole lot of time for questions, but you could ask questions at any time, is what I would challenge you to do. I'll stop sharing for right now. And I will say to one and all, thank you for listening. Thank you for giving me your ear. If there's any, if there's a couple moments for quick questions, I'm here. I'm not running anywhere. So if you got something that you'd like to share, please feel free to do so. To Carrie and to Edmund, thank you for allowing me an opportunity to just present on something so significant to America and its history. And I hope you guys find this information impactful for you.
David, thank you so much for joining us today and just for giving us a great education on a part of our history that isn't taught nearly enough. All right, if anyone has any questions for David, feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or if you want to put any questions you might have in the chat and we'll let him know. But we still have a few minutes, so now is the time. If you have any questions whatsoever, feel free. I asked David a couple when we were getting ready, and I will say he is accessible and willing to take any kind of questions you might have. Ask away. Tiffany, yes, we are recording it, and I will get it put up on our YouTube channel this afternoon. And for Morton Grove people, I will get the recording to Edmund and he'll get it put up on Morton Grove's.
Yep, ours will probably be posted by most likely Monday, but yeah, we'll get it up too.
Okay, David, can you see the chat? Yvette asked, why do you believe that Juneteenth and the Tulsa Race Massacre are not taught in schools?
Well, I think, and that's both of those are really good questions relative to the two incidents, because both happened later in my years in terms of just finding out about them. I think aspects of American history require some type of realization about something that could be perceived as less than or a failure. Yeah. And I think America has a hard time as a society grappling with something that didn't quite go right. But we have a long history of a lot of things that just didn't quite go right. And in order for us to be better, we have to address what didn't go right. As an example, instead of saying, well, we can bring Tulsa and put that in the books, and we can, and then we should, just like Juneteenth. And this is my perspective, so hear me on this. I think that land in Tulsa should be restored to Black people. It was their land. They didn't lose it. It was taken from them. And it was taken from them in a pretty contemporary time in American history. And then they buried bodies in who knows where, and they're going off looking for them. But all the development that's going on in that direct area right now, Black people have nothing to do with it. So I think sometimes we fail to own up to aspects of the challenging part of our history. And while we celebrate, and I think it's great to celebrate, I think America has a lot to celebrate. I learned a lot about ancestry and history for Juneteenth that wasn't all Black. You had some Caucasian people doing some powerful things back at that time. And watch this, they lost their lives doing this stuff. They were fighting for liberation. But, you know, some of us as Black people, we won't even give them credit. We just want to say all white people are bad. No, that's not our history. And so what we have a hard time doing is really bringing the truth to bear, to the forefront of American history so we can learn from it. And then if we've avoided it, I think Edmund said it earlier, if we've avoided it in the past, we'll just leave it there. We've never taught it, so why start teaching it now? And so I think that doesn't do future generations justice, so they can move past the 1865s and move past the 1921s, understanding its history, but move past those ideologies, you know, and start forming what should be a more perfect union.
Thank you. That was very gracious. Yvette also asked, yes, why are there no reparations offered in Oklahoma, Florida, or Texas? Japanese Americans were granted remuneration from World War II.
Yeah, I mean, and, you know, and I say this in a respectful format, so just hear me out, but, you know, check me on this. And, you know, there's aspects of Jewish history in America where just check per capita in terms of success ratios, especially from what Hayward said in his interview in 1937, because you could see where Hayward's mind was. His mind was simply, listen, am I going to be able to make money in America like I see everybody else around me? And then he pointed to white people, like I see them making, because that was tied to aspects of success. And so why I say the concept of liberation, you notice I never really said freedom all by itself, because freedom brings with it certain aspects of equity. And I believe because of that historical construct that I kind of listed for you, where this indoctrination thing is there, and that's a rough one, but it's a real one. You know, there is still this huge perception about people of African descent in America. And I could be wrong, but those of you all who understand American history and American culture, you know, there are places now in 2021 where I'm a pretty decently educated person. I can walk into that space and they would look at me interestingly if I'm the only Black person in that space. Well, why is that? And because of that type of thinking, it's still heavily ingrained in our systems and our policies and our procedures, which across the board is still not equitable for people of African descent in America. And so that's why it's difficult sometimes for us to be treated a particular way equitably. Had that guy not been videotaped, a police officer that killed George Floyd, if that had not been videotaped, we wouldn't have heard of that. I don't believe, that's just me. I don't think we would have heard of it. They may have talked about it, but wouldn't have heard of it the way that we did. And that's just one small example. So it's just the mindset. And that's why it takes these conversations, these forums. And I'll tell you this, it takes everybody who's listening now to get in a position to exercise your voice, to help the narrative, not to make it one-sided, but to help the narrative for equity. That's all I'm talking about. I'm not talking about give Black people preferential treatment or give this group. I'm just saying equity. There should be access that everybody should feel that they have the right to in America. And that's what history, that's what history teaches us. That's what those people in the 1800s, that's what they fought. Really, that's really what they were fighting.
David, you talked a lot about, you used the word equity can you just, for anyone listening or who might watch us later, can you kind of break down the difference between equality and equity?
Yeah, and I have this slide. I should have probably stuck it in there just in case, because I really like showing the slide when I do this discussion with students. And so I'll try to do the slide. I mean, I'll try to speak it verbally without the slide, but the slide is really cool because it shows it. And so equality says that everybody should be treated the same. That's what equality is. Equality is like equal. Equal means same, which means everybody that I'm talking to, there's 12 people other than myself. And so if everybody within this group right here is treated the exact same way, then they will have what they need to proliferate. And that's the challenge, because people are different. That's where the word diverse comes from. We're different interests, different perspectives. And with that comes a different way of perceiving, a different way of understanding. And so what equity does, though, equity says is we'll be cognizant of the differences to as much as what we can. And we will try to meet people where they are based upon who they are, as opposed to treating them the same. Now, equality is good in terms of how it makes sure everybody gets something. But equity says, I'm going to make sure that you have access to it as you are entitled to, so that you can do your best from your position. And so that's why when I see the basketball players and the people walking down the streets and I see equality, you know, and you know, like I hear all men are created equal. Well, no, people are created differently. I mean, all men are created equal. And another thing I say is that, you know, be mindful of this construct of saying, well, I'm colorblind. You know, that's like a statement of equality. I just see everybody the same. Well, I don't want you to see me as some figment of a gray tone. I'm a light-skinned Black man, and that's what I want you to see. And that makes us different, but that's a beauty of it. I want to see you all as, you know, different people. And so that's an equity statement, meaning that we respect all the differences and then we respond to people in that way, as opposed to just talking or treating or reacting to everyone the same.
That was great. Thank you. Oh, somebody else, Yvette said she loves your hope and she would love your image and quote on a t-shirt. Can you explain the meaning of Ku Klux Klan again?
Well, I didn't do an in-depth, but I got the snippet of what I got on it, because I didn't want to go deep into the realm of the Ku Klux Klan. Is that when they initially came out, they were extracting terminologies from other cultures. And they may have been pulling some stuff from Greek cultures or Greek, you know, words. And so the gist of what they were trying to do was build something to protect the mainstay. And the mainstay for them was prior to any slaves being freed, especially when the impact came through the way it hit in 1860, because that Juneteenth thing, even though it took time to spread, when it hit the way that it hit like a hammer. Because you imagine a whole state being influenced by military to say, this is what you're going to do. We're not asking you if you will do this. We're telling you this is what's going to happen. So there was some backlash. So they said, well, let's form from a Greek terminology, this circle, this clue, this circle of brothers or circle of friends, so that we can protect our interests. And I think out of the derivation or etymology of that came this terminology from a Greek term, which I had to get the word, the Ku Klux Klan, circle of brotherhood, circle of friends. And if you see their original symbol, I think it's a circle, right, with a cross in it. So it represents the circle, and the friends is supposed to be described by this cross, which connects them all together for the purpose of upholding this cause or this perspective.
Okay, Karen asks, doesn't equity also mean bringing everyone to a level playing field? So those who were kept behind must now be advanced. I think it's so they can become equal with everyone else.
Well, again, I always challenge the notion of equality because people are different, right? And the equity thing to me is a better perspective in terms of how you're posing your question. I think equity provides the opportunity for. What you make of the opportunity then becomes on you. But do you have the opportunity? Again, I just go back to our presentation. Harold was just saying, all I want is the opportunity. Because I know, and he even said, I know that I probably work as hard as any of my white counterparts out there. Give me that opportunity and let me see where I go with that. And I believe that's what the people in Tulsa, Oklahoma had. They just had an opportunity and they built from that. And so I think the goal with the equity component is just now I will put it in this way. Let me put it this way. Let me see if I can connect them together this way. Provide fair access. Provide fair access. That's the equity component. And then people will produce, proliferate, grow, expand based upon what they put into it. You can give somebody an opportunity and they not take the proper advantage of it, right? We know that's possible. And so, and then in society, you're always going to have people that just, some people are going to strive harder than others. Some people are going to work harder than others. That's, how, our quest for life is. Not everybody's going to work the same or strive the same. It doesn't mean that that's a bad, even or negative thing. And so in that regard, you probably won't have certain aspects of that type of equality. It's just like in the capitalistic system, right? You can have, think about the amount of money that is shared amongst the country's population, right? And the lower the percentage of the population is the people that tend to have this great deal of resources. Well, there's a reason for that, right? And some of that has to do with some of the stuff we're talking about now. I didn't mention the other part of this inequitable component, and I know this might be challenging to some who are listening. There's just a few of us listening, but policing. Policing was launched after 1865, you all. And the circle of friends were tied to aspects of that policing. And I'm not making this up, and I'm not saying it because it's and I'm not knocking police. I believe police have a great space in America to do a great job in America and to do a great work in America. But if you track early policing, what they were designed to do then was not to serve and protect. They were to keep the interests separate so that the wealthy or the well-to-do were not impacted by those who were not. And remember, you had a whole lot of impoverished people coming probably out of an 1865 era than you did, and then what we have now. So I believe the platform should be provided so that people can strive to do the best that they can. But I don't know if, equality will ever be attained. And I don't even know if that's a bad thing to say that everybody has to be equal. I understand what the statement means, but that's why I just keep using equity as opposed to.
Karen also states, it's not really a question, so I'm not gonna, fair access is great if everyone was starting from the same point, but Blacks were deprived of the fair wages for their labor over generations, and they are not starting from the same starting line as those who were able to build generational wealth for 400 years.
Well, and in that regard, I see the point there, but I also believe, and I think it's a good point, but I also believe if systemically, if policies and procedures were in such a way that spoke to all humanity, then I think you'd see a change in some of that. Because some of that in our historical concepts, we're not going to be able to go back and address. too far removed from history. But what I believe that we're beginning to see now, and I said this to Carrie and Edmund earlier, is there seems to be an awareness in American history where these younger generation of people who are a little bit more connected, interconnected with one another, and they do see each other as their differences. They recognize that. They're saying, listen, these policies need to reflect who we are, and we are just a group of different people, great different people. And so for us to continue to grow in that aspect, we're going to have policy, because they're beginning to impact policies and systems that reflect, who we are in terms of our differences and give opportunities to a variety of different people. I have some colleagues who, they take a hard stand when it comes to stuff like welfare and things like that. There was interesting conversations that I've had about aspects of those types of things. So I do believe that there should be some opportunities, but it should just be established on, in other words, don't prejudge, don't stereotype. If you see somebody's name on an application and you think that's the name of a Black person, well, don't say, well, I'm not going to interview them just because their name sounds like a Black. Interview them if they seem to be qualified, right? And so that's the type of thinking that, we need to begin to help inspire a little bit.
Do you think, just seeing you working at the College of DuPage, is education the answer to the problem? Or one of the answers to, I know it's not one problem, there's a lot of them, but.
I think education has a lot to do with it. I don't think it's the answer. I think it has a lot to do with it, because I think education happens in a variety of different spaces, in a variety of different ways. I'm looking at a family here right now on the screen, and I think that's a big deal, man. We learn a lot in our houses, a lot. I tell people all the time, some of us would want our conversations to leave our houses. Others would say, man, don't take that stuff out of the house. We're going to keep that in our house. And so part of this is how we're sharing, Carrie. So I think a big part of the education is us coming together to exchange. And listen, not be so threatened or afraid or because that's what happens. When I see people talking on our TVs, if you will, and they're not talking, they're just shouting at each other. And I'm like, okay, maybe they have extreme differences of views, but could they get more out of a conversation than they could out of this conflict? Mm-hmm. Number one. And so that sharing helps. Number two, we just go back to what we've been saying earlier. I think we really need to push legislation in such a way that makes education real. In other words, teach the truth. Because now all of these reports and the stuff that I researched was written by a variety of different people from different perspectives, different ethnicities, different walks of life, but they're all agreeing with one another. And so I'm thinking some in this history, and nothing is to disprove some of these facts. So I think some of this history just needs to be taught a little bit better, even small parts of it. You don't have to spend, a whole semester talking about Juneteenth, but if you open up a history book for some of these young children that I see if they open up a history book, I think it's fair that they at least understand a paragraph of what happened on June 19th, 1860. Do with it whatever you will, but at least they should know it. At least be introduced to it, so they don't have to wait until they get into their 30s or 40s to say, oh, I hear it now. And so I think the discussions, and then I think the education needs to be, I love education, I appreciate it, but there's some of our systems where they even train educators to teach certain ways. In other words, instead of educating people, just teach them a lesson. Well, we need more than just teaching lessons. We need people who are sharing the truth so that we can be better people.
Right. I'm seeing thumbs up from Gossamer. Okay. Does anyone else have any questions or comments before we dismiss? No, are we good? All right. Well, then I will let everyone go to enjoy the day. Evander says, thanks again, libraries and Mr. David.
Thank you.
Bye, Boulard
Thank you very much.
family.
Happy Juneteenth, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye,
Oh,
thank
you-
you
Thank you very much.
Happy
Yvette,
everyone. Thank you
Yvette
so
had
much.
one more comment. The media's misrepresentation of the impoverished and those in need can almost be deemed prejudicial. The federal government's profile of the average welfare recipient, gosh, I can't even talk, is not.
It's not a,
Finish her sentence. I don't know if she's still typing. But that's true
yeah.
too.
yeah, and it is not systemic, but it is stereotypical, right? So we have to be careful of media, but it's all propagated through different aspects of our thinking, and then how we continue to build on those thoughts. The people circulated the images of the people celebrating in Juneteenth. How many of those images got out versus the Willie Lynch letter, making of a slave? I can get tons of copies of the Willie Lynch letter, making of a slave today. I had a hard time finding that image about the people celebrating. So that's a very good point.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Yvette, for all your comments and questions. We really appreciate hearing your thoughts as well. It's been helpful. But again, with that, thank you, David. Thanks, Edmund. And thanks, everybody, for coming. Have a great day and happy Juneteenth.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.